IOE who deal directly or work directly with autistic students and learners and adults. I think everyone needs to know this because neurodiversity is everywhere. There are neurodivergent members of staff and neurodiverse students in every department. Just like population-wise, it's impossible that there aren't. But before I launch into this, I just want to know if anyone wants to tell me what they hope to get out of this, just so I know what to focus on, or, you know, does anyone, these windows are tricky. So does anyone want to share what they hope to get out of this? No. It's okay if you don't. Yeah, do you want to say something? No? Okay. Sorry, you look like you were about to say something. Okay, I will not put anyone on the spot, that's fine. So I am an autism researcher. I did my PhD here at UCL in the Department of Psychology and Human Development, and now I'm a lecturer in the same department and still at the Center for Research in Autism and Education. Cray's ethos is really about engaging with the autistic community here in the UK and beyond. We really think it's important to engage in priority setting in terms of deciding what we want to do our research on. It's really important to us that our research actually helps autistic people and we research things that is important to them. So that's basically what Craig wants to do. My expertise is in employment. So I will talk for the first few slides about more supporting autistic staff and what that might look like and how, and just generally about autism and employment, but then I will draw a parallel between autistic people in workplaces and autistic students in academic environments. And then my colleague Freya, who's a research assistant at Cray, will deliver the second half of the talk, and she'll be speaking about her experiences as a student, and also she's uniquely placed to talk about being a member of staff here at UCL. So, as Abby said, if you have any questions about anything that I say or anything that you read on the slides, please feel free to interject. I welcome questions or a discussion during the talk. But then I'll give you some time afterwards if you'd like to save your questions for the end. So, just a note on language. I've said it many times in the space of 5 minutes, but I'm going to be using the term autistic and not person with autism. So there was a study, a few actually, that sort of asked autistic people what they preferred, and an overwhelming majority said that they preferred identity first language, autistic person or autistic individual versus person with autism, which would be person first. So that's just what I'm going to use based on the preferences of the autistic people who were surveyed. I do acknowledge, however, that some autistic people prefer person with autism. I think it's always good to ask, but for purposes of this talk, I'm just going to go with what the majority prefer. None of what I'm going to say today is going to be deficit-based, and I'll talk a little bit more about the medical versus social models of disability during this talk. And of course, because this is a neurodiversity awareness program, that fits very nicely in with Cray's ethos of taking the neurodiversity perspective when thinking about autism. And I'll explain that a little bit more in case you're not familiar with it. So, just to sort of briefly contrast the medical versus social models of disability, the medical model sort of takes the view that deficits are inherent in autistic people. And that is reflected in sort of language that's been used in autism research probably maybe 50, 40, 30 years ago. Not as much today, but there are still some papers I've read that use this deficit-based approach. Social communication deficits, deficits in attention, those kinds of words. The medical model also has a focus on treating, sometimes even curing, autism and core autistic traits. There are a lot of interventions and therapies out there that focus on trying to suppress autistic traits to make people look less autistic and seem more normal. And that was actually quite a popular, or I would say common feature of early interventions. I think we're moving away from that, or I hope that we're moving away from that. The medical model also heavily leans toward a view of autism as a clear disadvantage. Basically, this is kind of reflected in how parents used to view an autism diagnosis, something of a tragedy. I mean, it can be really challenging, and I really don't want to invalidate those experiences, but we also don't see autism as a clear disadvantage. We see it as a neurotype, and that's where the social model of disability comes in, which aligns closely with the neurodiversity perspective. So the social model was actually introduced earlier than this. 1999 is the revised edition of this paper, but it was actually, I think, in 1945 or 1955, much, much earlier, where they took the perspective that disability exists, but it's the result of society creating barriers to inclusion. For example, a person who might have a physical disability or who may not be able to walk upstairs is disabled by a lack of access and by a lack of the stairs in the environment. They are not inherently disabled. So the social model also holds the view that being autistic is not something that can be cured or changed, and it shouldn't be. This ties in nicely with the identity-first language that I spoke about earlier. A lot of autistic people feel that autism is part of their identity, and it's something that they wouldn't want to change. It's a neurotype. It's the way their mind works. It is not a disease, and something that is separate to their identity. So to talk a little bit more about the neurodiversity perspective, or the neurodiversity paradigm, I just wanted to share this quote, which I think sums it up better than I could with my own words. Neurodiversity is a concept where neurological differences are to be recognized and respected as any other human variation. These differences can include dyspraxia, dyslexia, ADHD, dyscalculia, autism, Tourette's syndrome, and others. So neurodiversity also includes neurotypical people, people who might not have a sort of diagnosis or a self-identified neurotype such as ADHD, etc. So when you say neurodiversity, it also includes non-autistic people and people who don't have these other diagnoses. So, as promised, I'm going to speak briefly about autism and employment. In 2016, the National Autistic Society published this figure that 32% of autistic adults in the UK were in any sort of paid work. That means part-time and full-time. Last year, the Office for National Statistics published this lower figure, which is 22%, which is understandably very worrying. And in fact, autistic people constitute the most underemployed disability group here in the UK. I think the average for other disability groups is about 47%. Compare that to the general population, which is about 81% employed. And you can see what I mean when I say an employment crisis for autistic people. So, yes?
Sorry, so did you say that the previous figure for this was 32%?
32, yeah.
And that was in what year, sorry?
2016.
2016. Do you think that big change is to do with maybe the pandemic? Or is it inherently that the statistics have been taken in a different way?
I don't think it was due to the pandemic, because although it was published in 2021, the data was from earlier, and it was pre-pandemic, I believe, 2019. So unfortunately, it's not just the pandemic that's causing this. It might also be there's a greater proportion of diagnosed autistic people, but I also think that there's a real problem here that's getting worse. So autistic adults have expressed, many have expressed that they do want to work, but there are so many barriers to both finding and maintaining employment for autistic people. So even for those who do maintain a job over a long period of time, this can lead to burnout and extremely negative experiences such as discrimination, bullying in the workplace, etc. So it might be that, you know, autistic people can hold a job for a long period of time, but eventually the pressures of that job and the environment not being inclusive causes burnout or just drives them to leave that job. So workplace environments are often not inclusive places. Forgive me for referencing my own paper here. But it really is a problem with a lot of organizational cultures. Let me give you a concrete example of that. I worked on a study that was based in a large financial institution here in the UK. And part of the workplace culture was social events, going for drinks after work, those kinds of things that aren't written into your job description, but that make people like you. It's part of impression management, etc. A lot of the autistic people I spoke to struggled with that. They struggle a lot with those sorts of soft skills that are expected in a workplace but aren't really necessary to do your job. And unfortunately, a lot of what we do in the workplace is based on impression management. How much does your boss like you? How much do people think that you're a team player or someone who'll go out to drinks with everyone? Inevitably, when you have more face time with people outside of work, maybe you're thought of or given more responsibility in the actual workplace. That's really not inclusive of some neurodivergent people who prefer not to engage in those kinds of social activities. And my belief, having spoken to so many autistic people, I don't think it's fair that they're expected to, because they can do the job just as well or even better than non-autistic people. So some of the barriers to entering employment. We found that the recruitment stage can present so many barriers. Just navigating online applications, for example, with minimal to no support. With this same study where I spoke to interns at this financial institution, they flagged the assessment centers and group-based assessments that they were expected to do to get this job. Group-based learning can be really challenging. It is not just getting the job done, it's also navigating all of the social pressures that come with group-based activities. Job interviews are a big one. It's something that autistic employees have told me they really struggle with. If you think about what a job interview is, you're there because they've already deemed that your CV looks good, you've got the skills, you have the qualifications. Basically, you're there to make an impression. And having this, step where you have to make a good impression in order to enter the workplace can really disadvantage autistic people. Relies a lot on impression management, reading social cues, and there's a lot of research actually that says it's not even just the label autistic that people discriminate against, it's also the autistic behaviors that might be viewed as odd or rude. For example, not making extended eye contact, or maybe struggling with knowing when it's your turn to speak, or answering open-ended questions that are so common in interviews. Those are things that autistic people can really struggle with. So it's understandable that job interviews can act as a real barrier to employment. They also create situations that can be really ambiguous and anxiety-provoking. There's uncertainty around getting to the interview place, uncertainty around what this physical space will be like, what kind of sensory challenges that they might trigger, the lights, the temperature, the noise, those kinds of things can be really challenging. And also social conventions. If you're doing a job interview in person, and you get to the place, how long are you supposed to be expected to wait until the interview starts? Do you need to make small talk? Do you need to, after the interview is over, have to linger and make small talk? Those kinds of things are really unpredictable. And there are also unwritten social rules that can be very difficult to navigate for autistic job seekers. So there are also barriers to maintaining employment. I mentioned that a lot of autistic people struggle to get into work, but what about those who do manage to get into work? There's definitely a lack of understanding about autism from the majority of employers and colleagues. And I say that based on speaking to them and speaking to autistic people about their experiences with their employers and colleagues. Huge lack of understanding. There's awareness, for sure. I don't know if you guys know that April is Autism Awareness Month. In the autism research and the autistic community, we prefer to call it Autism Acceptance Month. But I also will say that this month can be really challenging for autistic people because it gives rise to a lot of tokenism and pretty words about inclusion and neurodiversity, but people don't do anything about it the other 11 months of the year. So I think awareness is good, it's a start, but it's not enough. I think understanding is more important. There's definitely this problem with a lack of adjustments. So I'll talk a little bit more about possible adjustments later, but often just to obtain adjustments, you have to disclose a diagnosis. This is how it works in most companies. That's how it works here at UCL. You have to, first of all, obtain a clinical diagnosis, which can be really challenging. There are huge disparities in accessing diagnosis in the UK. Sometimes people can wait 3 or 4 years to be assessed. So there's that. And then having to deal with the decision to disclose. On the one hand, you need to consider the benefits of this. Are there benefits? If you really need adjustments to do your job, it seems like you're forced to disclose. But there's also this risk of discrimination. and even bullying, and what your colleagues are going to do or say, or what your employer will think when you disclose. So the problem is, you might disclose to obtain adjustments and not even get the adjustments. And I've heard so many terrible stories about people who've struggled with the decision to tell people about their diagnosis, just to get adjustments that they never actually get. There's also a lot of misunderstandings. I've put here the double empathy problem, and Damien Milton, who's an autistic researcher at the University of Kent, came up with this in 2012. And it's the idea that it's not autistic people who are a problem in social communication. It's that there's a mismatch between how autistic people communicate and how non-autistic people communicate. So it's really a double empathy problem and not just the autistic person's problem. It's just a mismatch. And there's been some amazing researchers who've looked at this empirically, like Catherine Crompton. And really, what this means, she actually proved that autistic to autistic information or social communication is more effective than autistic to non-autistic social communication. So I want to say something about the sensory sensitivities that can be triggered in non-inclusive workplace environments. For example, the buzzing of this projector is something that maybe most of you can tune out when I'm talking. I know a lot of my autistic students would struggle with this because they hear everything all at the same time, and it's just not in their brains to tune out noise. So something like this would really distract them throughout this entire talk. Discrimination and bullying is something that I've already mentioned, but it can unfortunately be an outcome of disclosing. So, now I promised you that I would draw a parallel between employment and education, because some of you might be here because you want to support your autistic students better. So I have mentioned barriers at the recruitment stage, but actually we've spoken to a lot of our students who say that there are barriers at the application stage as well. Navigating a master's or a PhD application can be daunting and also confusing for all students. It might be more anxiety-provoking for autistic students as well. Uncertainty is something that we try to minimize with our autistic students, and this process of applying to programs does not do that very effectively. There's a lack of understanding, definitely, from employers and colleagues in the workplace, and there is, unfortunately, still a lack of understanding from teachers and peers in academic environments. I've already mentioned the lack of adjustments or delays in obtaining adjustments. I have students who've struggled to obtain a SORA or Statement of Reasonable Adjustments, or possibly, I think they're getting much better at that at UCL, but I have students who are still waiting on a SORA when their examinations are coming up, and that's when they really need them. And for both employment and education, you have harmful assumptions made about autistic people, discrimination, and bullying. When I say harmful assumptions, these can be positive assumptions as well. Oh, you're autistic, you must be really good at math or physics. That's not true of everyone. So I think those kinds of stereotypes, whether they're positive or negative, can still be harmful. So we worked on a couple of papers where we asked autistic people what kind of adjustments would make workplace environments more inclusive for them. And these are some of the things they said. So better disclosure protocols and support, which was actually the focus of my doctoral research, because disclosure is such a challenging thing in that it is so unpredictable, but sometimes it's necessary. Another one is inclusive recruitment or application processes, and I've already mentioned why those can create barriers for autistic people. This is an important one that I think is forgotten a lot of the time. Now, adjustments might come. They might come swiftly, they might come really slowly. But what's really important is that there's follow-through from any organization when it comes to implementing these adjustments. And I think they need to be evaluated regularly, because needs can change over time. If you're assessed at one point and it's determined that you need a certain adjustment, that can definitely change over time. You might need a different adjustment. So I think regular checks are important. This is something that autistic employees have told me is really helpful to them, having flexible work hours and the option to work remotely. In pre-pandemic times, a lot of companies weren't willing to do this. and they said it was impossible for these jobs to be done remotely. I think the pandemic has proved that a lot of them can be. So I spoke to someone who said working a 4-hour workday is the most optimal schedule for them, and having the flexibility to do that has increased their work tenfold in terms of how much they can do and the quality of their work. So I've spoken a little bit about workplace environments and sensory overload. There are so many things about workplaces that can trigger sensory sensitivities for autistic people. Noises like this projector, these kinds of lights, the kind of lights that have like a little bit of a halo around them actually can cause physical pain for some autistic people. Hot desking is one that causes a lot of anxiety, I think, for employees that I've spoken to, and open plan workspaces, which I don't think anyone likes. I mean, I don't think I've ever met anyone who likes that. So this is a really big one, and I think it's just a more general recommendation. There needs to be more predictability around things, and clarity in communication and hierarchy. What I mean about clarity and hierarchy is that a lot of the entry-level autistic employees I've spoken to have said that they weren't really sure who to go to when they had a problem, and sometimes they would go to like the top boss, and that just wasn't appropriate, but no one told them that. So having a clear hierarchy of who you go to and how you communicate with them when you have an issue, that's really important. And of course, the big one is just to increase knowledge and understanding of autism. Because I think people might think they know what autism is, but to be completely honest, autism isn't just one thing. And also, there is more variability in the autistic population than in the general population. So there are a lot of differences among autistic people, and it's really harmful to assume that if you've met one autistic individual, you know them all, and you know what everyone needs. For example, there is this prevailing assumption that autistic people love routine and hate change. That's very true for some autistic people, but I also spoke to some interns at this company who said, I really need to do something different every day or else it becomes monotonous and I get bored. And I don't like having a routine. So this might be helpful to you as well. So I teach on a master's program in special and inclusive education, and we've just started this autism route this year. We've got our first cohort, and we have some autistic students. And we've tried to make some adjustments that we thought might be more inclusive. And I will say that the adjustments that we've made aren't just good for the autistic students, they're good for everyone. So here's some examples of what our autistic students have said work for them. So for every synchronous session, we've done kind of a hybrid approach this term, where we have a lot of online content and they watch some lectures online, but then we have this synchronous in-person session every week. And for every synchronous session, a week before, we release detailed breakdowns of the schedule, down to the minute. How many minutes is this group work going to take? How many minutes are we going to discuss this thing? Here are the guide questions for this part of the session. And that has been really helpful. It's something that all of our students appreciate, but that our autistic students have particularly said is really helpful to them. And this is related to minimizing uncertainty, which I think is also really important. So I mentioned the guide questions and having the slides and other materials available in advance. So group-based learning. I think there is an assumption among teachers that autistic students just shouldn't do group work or struggle with group work and should therefore be given some alternative. But I think that's the wrong approach. I think group-based learning can work for everyone, but one of the most important things that we've been told works is having clear roles assigned. So there's a less ambiguity around who's doing what. So I talked about that as well, but it's worth repeating. So for assessments, we've tried to do something where, for every module, I'm sure you have like a clear your module handbook, you talk about the assessments, and their guidelines and questions, etc. But we also do like tutorial sessions throughout the term so that people can drop in and ask questions. This is something that I'm sure everyone practices, but in particular, having that extra support or our students knowing that they can come to us with any questions has been really helpful, and having dedicated times where they can do that. And again, just increasing the knowledge and understanding of autism for teachers and peers. I've had students struggle, for example, with pop quizzes or coming into a classroom and not knowing there's going to be a group work part of that session, which can be really anxiety provoking. And I really don't see any reason that this needs to be a surprise. So, learning is still happening, but giving students a heads up about that can be really helpful. So just general recommendations before I hand the floor over to Freya is just to improve understanding of autism among staff and students. Initiatives like this I think are really helpful. Adjustment should be timely and appropriate. And this is a big one, something that I guess I'll be working on throughout my career, but trying to change the culture of workplaces to just see the value in becoming more inclusive. I think we've had a lot of pushback from organizations where they're like, why should we do this? Like, this is a lot of our resources. It's really not. But I think it's just something that organizations might not think about or consider how they can do this, and the willingness maybe just isn't there. But I hope that changes eventually.
Thank you for having me. As I think has already been explained, I have COVID, but I really wanted to still do this talk because it's just really, really nice to be invited to come and talk in a situation where it's not trying to tick a box or improve someone's research, or it's not a psychology department. Yeah, it just felt like it was coming from the right place. That was really appreciated. So my name's Freya, and I have diagnoses of autism, ADHD, Tourette syndrome, and various other things. I am fairly unusual for someone born last millennium, that I was diagnosed in childhood, and that had like some impact on my education, but that I still made it to university. So I'm now a research assistant in Cray. I'm fairly unusual in that I am a research assistant, but I don't have a PhD, and I am not doing a talk like a PhD. I'm hoping that I might one day have a PhD by publication, but for various reasons, some of which I'm going to talk about, the current PhD system is not really accessible to me as a person with multiple conditions, including a physical disability. So yeah, thank you for having me. As per, also apologies, there's no slides because I'm ill. I really feel like that's giving a bad intro to what is best for autistic people, because often having even not all the words but just some slides to focus on is really helpful rather than just a face talking. But yeah, COVID massively threw my plans. But yeah, as per most disabilities, there's not that much research about neurodiverse employees, and even less on research about those of us working in academia. So I can offer some references. However, you'll find us remarkably absent in having our lived experience peer reviewed and cited. And a really good paper on this is Brown and Lee 2018, which is entitled "Where are the Disabled and Ill Academics?" And hopefully some of my talk and some of Mel's talk will have helped you understand where we all are. There are quite a few barriers to disabled people in academia, specifically in neurodiversity and specifically autism. You might have heard about the spiky profile, which was first described by Frankie Happe in '94. And it was originally used to describe the very different scores autistic individuals had in different areas of IQ assessment, which, IQ assessment is a whole separate problem, but it's also, this kind of spiky profile is often seen in educational achievement. So you might find that you have students, or you might have experienced yourself, where they do really well in one module or one assessment method, but barely pass in others. And this was definitely true for me throughout education. I would have assessments where I'd score over 90% and others where I'd fail or barely pass. And that averages out in a way that means that we're not really a concern often to tutors. We're not looking like we're maybe going to completely fail our degree, for instance, but it doesn't necessarily map up onto how you might perceive us, especially if we're a student maybe in one of your labs or classes that clearly really gets that specific area. But it also can mean that sometimes it's just seen as, oh, they didn't try or they didn't study for that specific assessment, which, is not impossible to be the case. We, not unique, we're still human. We're not necessarily giving 100% in every, you like different areas more than others and things like that. It's also really common for neurodivergent students to need special exam arrangements, such as extra time for processing, rest breaks, or separate rooms due to sensory issues, or they might need alternative methods of assessment. During my degree, I did multiple extended essays with vivas in place of exams. These, like, getting that alternative arrangement requires skills to negotiate and the knowledge that alternatives are available and which arrangements will help you. And this can be impossible to know until you've tried. And issues with assessments, as well as vastly varying academic achievement, can mean we're not seen as the type of student suitable for postgrad study, which obviously is the pathway into working in academia. And as I said before, our averaged academic attainment might be a real surprise to staff that we particularly get on with, or maybe that we've interned with in areas where we maybe really do have a really good aptitude. And therefore, our future in academia can really rely on those relationships and opportunities with that staff member or that lab, to realise that academia is a place where we could be, and that there is a path into it for us. And sometimes that can be just simply the encouragement to keep going with those modules that we really don't get or enjoy, especially if we maybe are extremely interested in another area. But equally, it can mean that we do need alternative assessments, and we maybe need help to negotiate for those. For all of us in actually working in academia in research areas, we obviously have our strengths and weaknesses, but these are not as pronounced as in the breadth of undergraduate or even master's level taught courses, because collaboration means that researchers, neurodivergent or not, can play to their strengths. We're not all the team statistician. I think it can be really, I certainly wouldn't be where I am without having had various people recognise that there were areas where I did know my stuff, even though I wasn't averaging out at a first. And I'm from a psychology background, so essentially over 72% doesn't really exist, which again is confusing as an autistic person. Should we manage to make it to working in academia or interning in academia, there are still many significant challenges. For instance, as I was saying earlier, each workplace has its own culture and its own way of utilising hierarchy, office space, how much colleagues socialise, and how much this is explained to new starters or to those transitioning from student to staff or colleague. As with someone joining the department from another country or another academic culture, such as, say, medicine, neurodiverse people are likely to really benefit from a guide to how things work. This includes things like who's who, diagrams of hierarchy, who to go to for what issue, any general trends, such as coffee in the kitchen around 3 p.m. on a Tuesday is like a a thing that happens to occur, and it's not a formal event, but it's a thing that kind of is a pattern that happens. And because it's not a formal event, it's typically something that wouldn't be explained to a new starter. But I think that can be really uncomfortable for neurotypical people, because they need to think about why things are done or not done in a certain way, or why people are in certain groups and not others. And it can be uncomfortable to confront those things, even if they aren't based on protected characteristics such as race or disability. That kind of work to deconstruct, or why is it that we do it this way, or why is it that these 4 people do go for a drink together, but why isn't it a wider activity? And it's not that that can't be like a valid thing, but it's just kind of being aware of, not just for neurodiverse people, but for, you know, people coming from lots of different backgrounds, about kind of why it works that way. And that can be as kind of, yeah. When I studied at UCL, I found the lack of like an overall diagram really difficult. My first role was as a research assistant on a project related to autism, but due to the PI, it was based in the division of surgery, where my potential colleagues and I didn't have a shared academic background. And additionally, even though this was before the pandemic, I was working remotely. So I really lacked any clarity about who was who when it came to resolving things with HR, such as contracts. And I'm sure if any of you have had to deal with HR, which I presume all of you have, that they can be incredibly slow with contracts and with paying you. And this was a massive struggle for me. I wasn't paid for the first 5 months of working for UCL, and I didn't know who to go to. I didn't know how anything worked. And I was just really, really lost. And that led to, along with other lack of clarity, lack of communication, led to me being at a point where I was signed off work. And if it hadn't been for my now manager at Cray, who was luckily kind of tangentially involved in the project I was working on, I wouldn't have come back, because I didn't know how to navigate the system, and there wasn't anyone helping me. And arguably my actual line manager should have been helping me, but he wasn't. And I would have made it into employment, which is, you know, this massive step for autistic people or for any person. But that challenges around maintaining employment are really key. And actually, as I'm going to go on to talk about in a minute, I actually came into this kind of setting with a lot of knowledge and experience that other people, especially maybe if they've just received an adult diagnosis or just realized that they are neurodivergent, they might not have. So even I found it that difficult. And that's because due to having multiple disabilities, and having had a diagnosis and other conditions since I was a child, I was particularly aware of my rights and potential needs as a disabled employee. And I did request an occupational health referral. I think, unfortunately, people often see occupational health as a consequence or a punishment for when things have gone wrong. And I'd really actually encourage anyone with a health condition or disability under the Equality Act to see occupational health, even though they're not always that useful. But this is because it puts it in writing about reasonable adjustments, and additionally that any time off related to that condition or disability cannot be counted to things such as promotion or references, which is, again, you know, once we've made it into employment as a neurodivergent or otherwise disabled person, you know, we are much less likely to progress. And I'd also say that to go to occupational health, you don't need a diagnosis. And I'm happy if anyone wants to email me to talk more about that process, then, you know, please do. Despite, you know, this kind of time off related to pre-existing conditions not being counted. This doesn't mean that autistic, otherwise neurodiverse or disabled people are taking time off all the time. We often actually work even when we're unwell. But it does mean that we're less likely to have to deal with like automated systems related to X number of days off within Y period of time. And ultimately it helps to limit the impact of disability discrimination. Within academia, you may come across people who are recently diagnosed and they're just learning, therefore, about their rights to reasonable adjustments and how to negotiate these. Not everyone does see neurodiversity as a disability. And my view is that even if you look through the social model of disability, we live in a society that's not designed for neurodiverse people. So even where we're like locating the disabling features are being due to things around us rather than deficits or things located within us, because we're still living in that society that is disabling. In my personal view is that I am disabled, and even if I didn't have my other conditions, I would count my neurodiversity as a disability. And in my opinion, therefore, we should make use of the legislation to limit the impacts of discrimination. Additionally, like about 80% of autistic people have mental health conditions. Some autistic people feel that their mental health conditions are as a result of a negative impact on their well-being due to trying to fit into a neurotypical world. And other people are just like, I have mental health conditions because I have mental health conditions, because lots of people do. Another co-occurring condition are obviously other forms of neurodiversity, not just autism, but like ADHD, neurological conditions such as Tourette's, epilepsy, and though it might seem bizarrely unrelated, hypermobility. So Mel raised issues around disclosure and whether or not to disclose about being autistic or neurodiverse. And this isn't something that I feel I can like really advise on, even though I kind of already have, because I have always been in a situation where I have had to disclose at least some of my disabilities. Some people might find it easier to disclose some things rather than others. So for instance, as a student, I found it easier to say I had extra time and a separate room in exams due to my Tourette syndrome, rather than the multiple reasons that I had these accommodations. Others might find it easy to say that they're dyslexic because that's something that people have heard of. They don't tend to think these days like any more further negative connotations. They're just like, oh, they're dyslexic. So staff might wish to access occupational health on the basis of one condition. They can then share with occupational health all their conditions, but they have the right to choose with occupational health which conditions are shared with their manager. Or you might find that you're able to get reasonable adjustments under the guise of one condition and not therefore fully disclose another. It's kind of something obviously you have to decide for yourself. The system is quite opaque and confusing, and that's why I've also said, if you want to email them, please do. But I'm by no means an expert. I've been here over 2.5 years. And on Monday, I found out about the Digital Accessibility Hub, which is somewhere that staff and students with disabilities or temporary needs, such as an injury or pregnancy, can access alternative chairs, keyboards, and ergonomic things, but also things that might help in a sensory environment in your office. Think about things like headphones or lamps so that you could use different light rather than the overhead light, things like that. You don't need occupational health to go to access the hub, but should you be getting any pushback about paying for those items, then that's where occupational health can come in, regardless of diagnosis. And then it's in writing and people have to. I'm as I said earlier, sorry, this talk is a bit all over the place. I was at a point where I had started working, but I was signed off and I kind of didn't really know how to come back. But I'm fortunate now to work in a research group that kind of gets me. It isn't because they research autism that they get me. As Mel said, that can cause almost more problems. A kind of example of the double empathy problem. It can cause a situation where I assume a basic level of knowledge because they research autism, and they assume that I'm a certain way because I'm autistic. And that's actually not understanding at all. And the reason that Cray kind of gets neurodivergent people is that they understand that neurodivergent people are as diverse as neurotypical people. For instance, I know that I don't hold hierarchy in reverence in the same way that other people do. This means in meetings, I might, as a very junior research assistant without a PhD, query a professor or team statistician on their method. And this can have really good outcomes, such as recognizing problems before they become problems. But it can also mean that even if the professor or statistician is not at all bothered, and maybe they're actually quite excited that someone's asked a question and they get to actually talk about their specialism, that someone in the middle between me, kind of very junior, and this fancy person, maybe is very uncomfortable with the fact that I've asked that question, and they might think that it's disrespectful. And this isn't an issue for me in Cray, but when I've been on other research teams, it has been, even where that has had, other autistic people there, or yeah, but actually it's not, I've not been rude, and it has been of an overall benefit, but people, again, kind of having neurodivergent people in your workplace hopefully leads to people asking, well, why is it done this way? Or why is it a problem to ask this question? And often you'll find that you come back to, well, it's just the way we do it. And the challenge to that is that just because is not actually a good enough reason. And it's not a reason we would apply to our own research. And all our workplaces really need to consider critically why things function the way they do and how this impacts different people in those workplaces. And as Mel said earlier about the pandemic, has really highlighted and shown what can be achieved when things have to change, and there is a will to do so. For instance, were it not for having COVID, I would have been there in person today. I actually work remotely, except for where my research requires me not to, because I can't put EEG machines on people's heads remotely. This has been the case for me since 2019, but it wasn't recognised by UCL as even an option until the pandemic. And in autism research, we know that actually where people conducting research with autistic people, but asking that autistic participant to come to a loud, busy central London office, it doesn't lead to the best experience for our participants. And it therefore definitely doesn't necessarily mean that we get the best data. And this doesn't mean that no research happens face-to-face or that there isn't a value to that. As I said, like I can't run EEG studies from people remotely. But I have found throughout my experience of education and employment that often I'm fighting for adjustments that enable me to perform my best. And there's often a lot of pushback only for these adjustments to become the norm, or for them to have recognised benefits for everyone regardless of neurotype. For instance, earlier I talked about how in place of some of my exams, I actually did extended essays with vivas. And as much as obviously for some people, and including some neurodiverse people, that would be their worst nightmare, my university for undergraduate actually realised that, oh, this is actually far more realistic to what we'd expect for Oh, I'm talking too long. I can't hear you.
She's asking if it's all right if we go to the Q&A in a minute.
Yeah, I just have like one more paragraph-ish.
Oh.
Yeah, so things that often people are going, oh no, we can't do that. It's impossible. And then magically people realize the benefit of it when it comes to the masses. As I said earlier, I came into further education and then employment with a lot of knowledge, and I had an established medical diagnosis. I knew that I was disabled under the definition of the Equality Act, and I knew I had rights. I already had experience of needing to advocate for my rights from people who in no way viewed themselves as discriminatory, but to whom I also needed to not appear rude. This is really challenging, and if you aren't disabled or from an ethnic minority or other minority group, you won't necessarily understand the need to both fight for your rights, but to do so nicely, because you're relying on these people who are being discriminatory to help you. I don't want to encourage disabled people to have to ask nicely, but the reality is that the way we ask massively impacts the potential for being considered worthy of our rights. This also means that people who've only recently realized they're neurodivergent, and that thus this may be their first experience of negotiating around access and discrimination, for instance, if they're white, they might not do so in the way that you as a line manager or supervisor view as correct. And you might also wonder why, if someone has only just identified that they're neurodiverse, do they suddenly need these adjustments? Again, as Mel has spoken about, a lot of autistic and neurodiverse people struggle to stay in employment, and staying in their jobs, coping without adjustments, just has a really massive cost on mental health and well-being, often leading to burnout, which may present as someone being off with stress, or may also be referred to as someone having a breakdown. Realizing that actually you experience the world differently to others, and that they don't hear the electricity in the switches, or are able to concentrate without great effort and exhaustion, or the lights don't cause them pain, or they don't plan their day to the minute, or they don't have to make lists and lists and lists in order to not be seen as disorganized or forgetful. Realizing that you're actually going through the world differently and experiencing the world differently to others, and that therefore you're allowed to access it in a way that is easier for you, is quite a kind of realization to come to. So to summarize, though it does require to some extent disclosure, which is an individual choice, I really do encourage neurodivergent people to seek out occupational health and make use of the Equality Act. Importantly, that allies should also ensure they understand that reasonable adjustments are a right, and this involves some serious deconstruction and introspection about why things are done in a certain way, or why you might perceive an adjustment as being over the top or unfair. Yeah, and again, if people want to email me about navigating UCL's occupational health or digital accessibility hub or any of those things, then please do.